Globalization. Every time we hear the word globalization, what immediately comes into our minds is that it's all about growth and development in a global level. Interconnectedness of economies of different countries, advanced technologies, innovation, and the list goes on. Now, have you noticed that everything that I have just mentioned are all positive things? Well, yeah, globalization does really bring us a lot of benefits. In fact, all the things that I have just said earlier are just some of the countless opportunities that globalization has to offer. But has it ever crossed your mind that all of these seem too good to be true? Because nothing's free, right? Everything has its own price. At some point, it should also have its own negative consequences. Well, sorry to tell you, globalization does really have its own negative consequences, which you may or may not be aware of. Hi, I am Renzo, and together with my groupmates, we are going to present about the negative global flows and processes. While globalization has brought many positive consequences to the world, bringing people and countries closer together, removing borders, providing an easier way for every process, it also carries negative effects in different aspects. Most of the time, we've always been presented mostly just about how the world, the different countries, and the human race benefited from globalization. Halimbawa, kung kailangan pa nating isulat sa papel at maghintay ng ilang buwan bago pa natin maipadala ang ating mensahe sa mga minamahal natin sa buhay na nasa malalayong lugar, lalong-lalo na sa ibang bansa. Ngayon, sa isang pindot na lamang ng ating telepono, ng ating mga cellphone, o sa pamamagitan ng social media platforms, ay madali na lamang nating naipahahatid ang ating mga mensahe sa ating mga mahal sa buhay, o kung kailan man natin gusto. Ang galing, di ba? Ngunit, sa kabila ng lahat ng ito, marami ring hindi magagandang dulot ang globalisasyon. When the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, spreads its message around the world to recruit militants in far-off countries, or when the Russian intelligence hacked American computers to shape democratic process, these are all examples of negative global flows. Halimbawa na lamang ngayon, ang mabilisang pagkalat ng coronavirus na naging sanhi ng malawakang pandemya ay dulot din ng globalisasyon. Dahil sa mabilis na pagkilos o paggalaw ng mga tao mula sa isang lugar patungo sa isang lugar, ay kasabay rin nito ang mabilis na pagkalat ng sakit, na ngayon ay nananalasa na sa buong mundo at kumitil na ng milyong-milyong buhay. There are many manifestations of negative global flows and processes, but in our discussion, we are just going to focus on these four aspects. First, the dangerous imports. Second, borderless diseases. Third, terrorism. And lastly, war. Now, before we proceed, we should note that the issue of what is regarded as positive or negative about globalization often depends on one's perspective and position. Halimbawa, itinuturing ng marami ang grupong NPA bilang mga terorista at ang kanilang mga gawain ay isang uri ng terorismo at isa itong negatibong bagay. Ngunit ito ay nagiging positibo sa paningin ng mga kasapi at sumusuporta sa naturang grupo. Next, negative globalization involves not merely negative flows and processes, but also structures whose effects at least some would regard as largely, if not totally, negative. Halimbawa, kung sa paningin ng iba ang kapitalismo ay isang negatibong daloy at proseso, magiging negatibo na rin ang mga taong sumusuporta o naniniwala sa kapitalismo tulad ng mga taong nagmamay-ari ng mga malalaking kumpanya. Gayon din, kung ang neoliberalismo ay tinuturing na isang negatibong daloy at proseso ng ilang tao, magiging negatibong daloy o proseso na rin ang mga institusyon o struktura na sumusuporta dito tulad ng International Monetary Fund at ang World Bank. Now that we already have a background on negative global flows and processes, we can now move on discussing its first example. Dangerous imports. Because of globalization, importation of products has become so much easier. Halimbawa, ang Pilipinas ay isa sa mga pinakamalaking producer ngayon ng buko, pinya at saging sa buong mundo. Madali at mabilis na lamang itong naipapadala o naiaangkat ng Pilipinas patungo sa ibang bansa dahil sa globalisasyon. Gayun din ang ibang bansa, madali lamang nila o mabilis na nilang naipapadala o naiaangkat ang kanilang mga produkto patungo sa ibang bansa kasali na ang Pilipinas lang dahil din sa globalisasyon. However, also because of globalization, the flow of all sorts of products from every corner of the world has made it near impossible to know precisely the true nature of those entering a country. Dahil sa globalisasyon, mahirap na ring tuntunin kung saan nga ba totoong nanggaling ang isang produkto. Lalong-lalo na ang mga naprosesong produkto na naglalaman ng mga iba't ibang kasangkapan na nanggaling sa ibang bansa. Halimbawa na lamang ng mga cosmetic products na gawa sa South Korea. Maaari itong maglaman ng mga kasangkapan na nagmula sa Thailand, sa India, sa China o sa iba pang bansa. Kung bibilin, aakalain natin ito ay nagmula sa Korea, ngunit sa katotohanan, ang mga kasangkap nito ay nagmula sa ibang bansa at ang South Korea lamang ang nagproseso nito. Here are some countries which had an issue on dangerous imports. Ang China ang isa sa mga pinakamalaking exporter ng iba't ibang produkto na pinagkukunan naman ng imports ng iba't ibang bansa sa buong mundo. Kilala ang China bilang isa sa mga pinakamalaking producer ng electronic supplies, gadgets, at maging ng mga agricultural na produkto tulad ng tsaa, bigas, at soybeans. Kilala rin ang China bilang isa sa mga pinakamalaking nag-e-export at gumagawa ng manufactured products tulad ng mga laruan, gamit sa kusina, at iba pang mga gamit sa bahay. Noong 2008, natatandaan umugong ang issue tungkol sa kemikal na melamine. Ang melamine ay isang kemikal na ligtas naman gamitin sa paggawa ng mga plastik, seramiko, at iba pang mga industrial na produkto at kasangkapan. Ngunit kapag ito ay nadirektang naihalo sa pagkain ng tao, ito ay labis na nakalalason. Sa isyong nabanggit, napatunayang isa sa mga brand ng infant formula na galing sa China ay nahaluan umano ng melamine. Agad namang ipinag-utos ng gobyerno ng China na bawiin ang lahat ng supply ng produktong nabanggit mula sa iba't ibang uri ng pamilihan sa buong mundo. Ang iskandalong ito ay naging malaking usap-usapan hindi lamang sa China kundi sa buong mundo. Hindi rin ligtas ang Pilipinas sa issue ng dangerous imports. Sa katunayan, nasangkot ang bansa sa isang kahalintulad na issue kamakailan lamang. Ito ang Lucky Me Corporation, na kung saan matatandang ipinag-utos o inanunsyo ng mga bansa sa Europa na bawiin at ibalik ang mga produkto ng naturang korporasyon. Sapagkat ayon sa kanilang pag-aaral o panunuri, ay nakakitaan umano ang kanilang mga produkto ng isang nakalalasong kemikal. Bagamat pinapayagan ito sa Pilipinas dahil ayon sa FDA ay natural lamang na nakikita ang kemikal na ito na ginagamit sa pagproseso at pagpreserba ng mga kasangkapan, walang nagawa ang Lucky Me Corporation sapagkat ito ay pinagbabawal naman ayon sa standards ng mga bansa sa Europa. Kaya naman, napilitan ang Lucky Me Corporation na bawiin at pabalikin sa Pilipinas ang kanilang mga produkto na naipadala o naiangkat sa mga bansa sa Europa. Narito naman ang mga iba pang bansa na nasangkot rin sa issue ng dangerous imports. Una, ilan sa mga kumpanya sa Amerika ay natuklasang nag-aangkat o nag-e-export ng mga ipinagbabawal na pharmaceutical na produkto patungo sa ibang bansa. Pangalawa, marami sa Western countries, lalong-lalo na ulit ang United States, ang napatunayang nagpapadala ng mga kanilang barko na nadikomisyon na patungo sa Timog Asya upang ito ay lansagin at buwagin. Ang proseso ng paglalansag o pagbubuwag sa isang barko ay isang madumi, delikado, at isang mahirap na gawain. Ito ay maaaring magdulot din ng polusyon. At panghuli, ang isang Swiss company na Nestle ay napatunayang nagpapadala o nag-aangkat ng mga baby formula patungo sa mga bansang nasa timog, lalong-lalo na sa Africa, kahit na ito ay alam nilang maaaring magdulot ng hindi maganda sa kalusugan ng mga sanggol. Now that you know all of this, next time that you purchase a product, be sure that it's not a dangerous import.
Hi, I'm Mariela Nenpagay, and now let's talk about the borderless diseases. So, the term borderless diseases refers to the infectious disease agents that exhibit considerable global mobility. Meaning, ito yung mga sakit na pwede nating maipasa through moving from one country to another, which have become much more common and have spread rapidly in recent years. So some of the examples of these borderless diseases are plague, tuberculosis, malaria, and sexually transmitted infections or STI. And we all know that STIs are infections that are transmitted from infected person to an uninfected person through sexual contact. So to give a specific example of an STI, we have the syphilis, which has recently spread in most likely less developed countries. So now, saan nga ba nanggaling yung mga gantong cases ng STI? So based on the readings, it was spread through European colonialism and military exploit. So that means, yung mga French military soldiers, yung mga nagpakalat ng gantong diseases. And that is why it came to be known as the French disease. So as time passed by, syempre, natadagdagan yung mga tinatawag nating borderless diseases. And some example of this are the severe acute respiratory syndrome, the BCE or the bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease, and the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So both BSE and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease can cause a brain damage. But the question here now is how these diseases related to the globalization. So the nature of these diseases and their spread tell us a great deal about the reality of globalization in the 21st century. In what way? So for example, yung chikungunya virus. So we all know that maraming cases ng chikungunya virus sa Africa and Southeast Asia. And due to globalization, nag-spread siya through the Western Hemisphere. Another thing is the HIV or AIDS. So this is an example of STI. Ito yung mga diseases na maipapasa lang through a sexual contact or in a blood transfusion. So the spread of AIDS or HIV is closely linked in globalization, especially in the increased global mobility associated with tourism, or specifically the sex tourism. So initially, itong AIDS or HIV is symptomless, kaya we may have it without us knowing na meron pala tayo nun. And therefore, hindi rin natin alam na may ability pala tayong makapasa ng ganitong disease sa ibang tao through unprotected sexual contact, not only sa kabansa natin, but also tuwing nagta-travel tayo sa ibang bansa. The same with the Ebola virus, or the Ebola hemorrhagic fever. It is a viral disease that was first identified in Sudan and Zaire. So unlike the HIV or AIDS, the Ebola virus can be contracted and spread through direct contact with bloods, body fluids, and tissues of those who are infected. Or it can also cure through handling a chimpanzee. So pag hinawakan mo yung chimpanzee na meron pala ng sakit na yon or namatay dahil sa sakit na yon. So since we've been talking about the cases of diseases that came from South, now let's talk about the tropical diseases in Europe. So this tropical disease in Europe is related to the another global problem that has been discussed by the previous group, the global warming. So one of the consequences of global warming is the increased ability of disease-bearing vectors from hot tropical areas to survive in areas like Europe they were previously buried from. So example of this are mosquitoes. Climate change creates conditions that make it easier for the mosquitoes to survive, and it opens the door to the diseases that didn't exist here previously. And that's the real issue now. So for example, may certain country na nagpadala ng mga gulong sa Italy. So, hindi nila alam na yung mga gulong pala na yon may mga tiger mosquito na may dalang viruses. So since then, nag-spread the virus without them knowing. And that's one example of how tropical diseases spreads in Europe. And thus, that's how globalization connected with the borderless diseases.
Hi, this is Amy Paredes presenting the third topic under Chapter 3, which is Terrorism. So terrorism, as defined by Remand 2007, causes death, serious bodily injuries, and serious damage to public or private property, and the like. Also, it aims to intimidate citizens, governments, or international organizations. Now, though, it has become a label that those in power impose on those who are not. Say, for example, the US to Al-Qaeda, even when they perform similar acts of terrorism. So according to Martinez, 2017, there are key distinctions for terrorism. The first one is terrorism from above, those that are undertaken by nation-states such as ISIS or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and the second one is the terrorism from below, or those which involve violence against non-military targets and citizens and are performed by stateless organizations such as the Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda means the base in Arabic. Anyway, so these are currently the two most prominent and existing terrorist groups we know today. As discussed in Chapter 10, there are earlier and present manifestations of terrorism. The first aspect is the organization. So in the past, they were mostly by leftist solidarity groups such as the Weather Underground in the US and the Shining Path of Peru, who are united by their shared purpose and interest. Now, they are mainly of groups such as I've mentioned earlier, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who are fueled by religious beliefs. So before, terrorizing acts are performed for national interest. For instance, the traditional Islamic militant groups like the Hamas and Hezbollah, who captured state power and revolutionized national societies via the state. Now, there are paradigmatic terrorist organizations with global aspirations and reach, like the Irgun Zvailumi, which is a Jewish military group who acts in and around the future territory of Israel and broadcasted it to a global audience. Another distinguishing characteristic, according to Rubner 2017, of today's terrorist groups is their greatly enhanced ability to get their message across to a global audience simultaneously. This was a goal by earlier military groups, but was a difficult feat to achieve because they had limited means at their disposal. Modern day groups, on the other hand, have access to the international media and global communication channels, which allows them an easy dissemination of information to a mass audience, and most importantly, direct control or manipulation of the message delivered. The best example for this is the electronic jihad by the Al-Qaeda, which posts self-produced videos that are broadcasted via major media outlets and websites. So, according to Nora Satina, 2005, global terrorist organizations, or for the purpose of this report, referred to this as GTOs, are now considered as complex global microstructures having 4 basic characteristics. First, it is light. So far from our usual ways in modern institutions, microstructures are coordinated not by heavily formal or conventional methods, nor from strict implementations of a structure and organization. So it simply means that their method of coordination are similar to how face-to-face or let's say casual relationships are employed on a daily basis. Second is the ability to outsource. In relation to the first characteristic, which I've mentioned, is it is light, meaning it is casual. With that being said, it means that they have removed heavy restrictions and regulations, so GTOs are able to maximize their ability to adapt, and so they're able to find support and resources for their activities in different and unconventional yet extremely effective ways. So the technologies such as hijacked airplanes and the utilization of social media are the best examples for this. The third characteristic of a microstructural terrorist organization is a multi-connectivity. So GTOs are connected by and for multiple reasons, as in the case of Al-Qaeda, aside from its Islamic religious representations, its familial structures as well as its self-producing mechanisms hold it together as one network or microstructure. And finally, GTOs are temporally and organizationally complex. So the best example for this is the 2 most prominent terrorist groups. So both of these organizations have maintained their existence until today. Though widely dispersed, the members of Al-Qaeda and ISIS are held together by close linkages between common situations experienced today, as well as their collective memory of the past. So from terrorist extremism, we now have the Qaedaism, or the contemporary ideology of terrorism, at least from what I understood. So it becomes relatively easier to convert a group simply through dissemination of powerful ideas. So in Europe, as well as the United Nations, and more fervently, the United States have undertaken steps around the world to combat terrorism. However, certain reactions, such as the war on terror by the United States, by which they commit lawless behaviors and tactics that are indistinguishable from those of terrorists, weaken their ability to convince the public opinion about the justness of their cause and the legitimacy of their objectives. So, this ends my discussion of the third topic under Chapter 10, which is terrorism.
Hi, this is Ishi and I will discuss the topic about war. A war is a state of armed conflict between different nations or states or different groups within a nation or state. War is increasingly influenced by globalization. Even before, until now, yung mga nation ay nag-engage in war in some capacity, whether it be preparing for war, in the midst of war, or recovering from a war's aftermath. Yung mga state, commonly, nagamit nila yung violence against other state. Sa contemporary era naman, since yung mga bansa ay mas na-experience na yung longer periods ng peace, hindi na masyadong naganap ng mga wars or geopolitical conflicts. I-distinguish naman natin yung Cold War and Cold War. Sa Cold War, yun yung nag-inflict sila ng much damage sa another country or state. Pero ngayon, nakalikan na yun ng form ng mass violence and na may mixture ng war, organized crime, and wide-scale of human rights violations. Sa war naman, yung parang reason nila or basis nila para mag-Cold War ay yung traditional identities like national, tribe, religion, pero they become entangled in war through yung global conflicts. For some naman, yung global interconnectedness naman interpreted by an indication that the incidence of war might decline with globalization. And however, the economic gains of war, this access to weapons in the global era might actually lead to an increase in warfare. In terms of global military structures naman, merong NATO or North Atlantic Treaty Organization na nabuo na 1949 as a reaction against the growing threat of the Soviet Union. And currently, may 29 nations kasama sa NATO and mostly are from Western Europe, pero kasama din ng Canada and United States. Tapos in recent years naman, may mga nag-join na rin like former Soviet bloc nations.
Drones and other technology. Drones are easily the most rapidly growing and most controversial military technology in use today. And sino pa nga mag-access or maka-afford ganitong technology? They yung mga developed countries like the United States. American officials report that the advantages of drones include their accuracy and the reduced risk they provide to its military personnel, making them more effective in warfare. Ang largest exporter naman ng drones ay Israel. And yung mga clients nila ay Mexico, Russia, and Nigeria. And as other nations and terrorist networks continue to develop their military technologies, drones will be an increasingly important global dimensions of war.
Sa paglaganap nga ng mga bagong technology, nagkaroon ng mga new form ng war like information war and cyber war. Sa cyber war, ito yung mga cyber attacks sa mga computer systems na para makapag-spy, makapag-manipulate ng system, mga ganun, and makapag-sabotage. Example ng cyber attack naman na nangyari is yung nung US National Security Agency and the Israeli military ay nagawa ng worm para yung nuclear enrichment program ng Iran ay masira. And sa paglaganap nga ng computer network sa ating digital age present, in the future, mas malala pa yung mga mangyayaring attack. Information war naman, ito yung paggamit ng information, misinformation, and information technology sa pag-conduct ng war. Information war din, included dun yung mga fake accounts, trolls, fake news, na mga nagpapalaganap ng maling information para lang mabago yung behavior ng public or yung views nila or perception nila about certain things like political, so like yung mga candidates, yung mga brands, and yung mga event. Industrial war, doon yung mga like, gumagamit sila ng mga weapons, guns, mga para lang makipag-war sa iba. And doon naman sa sa light or information war, dito naman yung kasama na dito lahat ng pag-forms ng war. Like, kasama na rin yung sa technology.
Good day, ma'am. I am Jean Audrey Millar from BISAC 2-2, and I will elaborate the impact of negative global flows on individuals as related to the topics discussed by the previous presenters. The negative flows discussed in this presentation deal with large-scale aspects of globalization, dangerous imports, borderless diseases, terrorism, and war. This is to a large degree because globalization itself is large. Thus, in consequence, its various negative flows have also a broad or wide-range profound effects on individuals. Hence, some of the adverse effects of globalization include people being victimized or even killed due to global crime, citizens bearing the cost of global corruption, innocent people becoming victims of terrorism, and numerous civilians dying in war and having their lives destroyed. In addition, the United Nations Development Report also identifies some insecurities linked to negative global flows, which are flashed on the screen, namely financial volatility insecurity, job and income insecurity, climate change and environmental insecurity, health, economic, cultural, personal, political, and community insecurity. These insecurities exist on a global scale, but they also manifest on individual levels. Individuals are suffering. They are affected by global economic crisis and wars, and suffer from fear of AIDS, hostile neighbors, identity theft, effect of global warming, and the worry of being entangled with a failed or failing state. Overall, it was argued that globalization is toxic to individuals and their emotional lives, since it causes personal problems such as hyper-individualism, privatization, and decreasing solidity and durability of personal identity. Yes, globalization may allow individuals to be more flexible and open-minded, but there is no denying that the new global individualism indeed emotionally damages people. Moving forward, let me summarize our presentation. Overall, this chapter analyzes the negative global flows and processes linked with globalization, namely dangerous imports, borderless diseases, terrorism, and war. With globalization, such flows can move more easily and quickly across borders. First, we have importation. Imports rise as a result of globalization. Thus, products are prone to the spread of contaminants due to the length and complexity of global value chain that involves in importation. And usually, it is difficult to identify the source of contamination since the products or the ingredients came from different places or locations. Next is the transmission of borderless diseases. Globalization increases people's mobility, consequently increasing the possibility of spreading diseases. This problem demands an adequate global response. Why? Because these diseases frequently affect the most vulnerable groups, who are also the least likely to receive or to access expensive medical treatment that are necessary to combat these diseases. The third is terrorism. Terrorist actions are growing along with globalization. They are no longer restricted to their home territory and can strike anywhere in the world. This is because of the easier access to sophisticated technologies that enables them to transmit messages to a more wide global audience. And lastly is warfare. Warfare, which is increasingly influenced by globalization as well. Due to global interconnectedness, the likelihood of war may either be reduced or increased. Because of the economic relationship built between nations through globalization, the occurrence of war may be reduced only if they will consider the relationship they have already been established between themselves. On the other hand, wars may still increase due to the economic gains and the easy access to weapons nowadays. Today, new forms of war continue to emerge such as information war and cyber war, which are fought using broader networks already. In conclusion, this chapter primarily focuses on showing the negative side of globalization, particularly the four main aspects discussed. Although globalization is advantageous and beneficial in certain ways, there are still downsides which need to be addressed and solved in the present and in the years to come. And that ends our group presentation. I hope you've understood something. Thank you so much for listening.